Hi, I'm Debbie Millman, and I host a podcast called Design Matters from the TED Audio Collective. Every episode, I have conversations with designers, writers, artists, and other luminaries of contemporary thought. People like Roman Mars, Ai Weiwei, Ethan Hawke, and Ashley Ford. Join us for an inquiry into the broader world of creative culture. Find and follow Design Matters with Debbie Millman wherever you're listening to this.
I'm Eileen Kinsella, and this is World Infamy, a podcast miniseries from ArtNet News. It was morning on June 11, 2020 in Port Vila, Vanuatu, an island nation in the South Pacific. Inigo Philbrick and his then-fiancée, Victoria Baker Harbour, were shopping in a local store when a group of uniformed police officers and marshals suddenly descended on the two. The blood drained from his face as they approached and asked, "Are you Inigo?" They then quickly hustled him into a car and sped toward the local airport, where he was placed in zip ties and led across the tarmac toward a private jet that was waiting on the runway. Even more surprising, this extraction, as it was called, happened at the height of the global COVID lockdown. No one was supposed to be leaving or entering the country. Suddenly, the art dealer's false sense of security, including a belief that he could not be arrested, went up in smoke. After stops in Tokyo, New Caledonia, and Australia, Inigo and Victoria had eventually settled in Vanuatu. They did so with the understanding that the small country had no extradition treaty with the U.S. Most people who are familiar with the island only know it because the 9th season of the hit reality show Survivor was filmed there. Roughly 6 months after he vanished, in May 2020, I started to receive details from several people claiming to know where he was. According to them, the couple was leading a relaxed life on Vanuatu, hiking, taking tennis lessons, and becoming regulars at a local coffee shop. They became friendly with some of their neighbors and got involved in animal rescue efforts. They even adopted a puppy that they named Bacchus. One resident of the island, who often saw Inigo when he was getting coffee in the morning, actually sent me a picture that he had snapped of him from behind so as not to set off any alarms. Another told me Inigo had been inquiring about home insurance and buying a boat via email.
He's planning on staying here for sure. He has a big 4x4 truck he paid cash for.
In a character letter to the courts, Inigo's neighbor in Vanuatu, expat Karen Adams, wrote,
"During their time in Malay village, Inigo became very good friends with the native villagers. He would give them gifts of food and clothes and offer them money in return for small jobs, as the area had a very low employment rate. Inigo soon became ingratiated into Malay village and was well loved and respected. He was honored enough to be given the nickname Man Malay. It may be hard to understand, but the local population are very mistrusting of visitors and rarely allow us into their customs and village, so Inigo was extremely touched at their kindness and acceptance. Inigo is a kind and extremely generous person. He wants everyone around him to be happy and content. He finds joy in the simplest of things: a beautiful tree, a kaleidoscopic sunset, a cheap but exquisite bottle of Sancerre picked out at our local Chinese takeaway. We miss him. Vanuatu misses him. I truly believe that Vanuatu had the real Inigo Philbrick."
When one resident approached Inigo about the scandalous headlines, he told them that it was all civil cases and that it was doubtful it would ever go beyond wealthy people saying and writing nasty things about him. He made a comparison about the mess he had left behind to people fighting over a carcass, and snarkily predicted that they would probably get back more than their share of what they had lost. But that's not how the U.S. government saw it. Having bilked people out of millions of dollars, Inigo's underhanded art deals and the scope of his fraud drew serious attention from authorities. The fact that he fled the country when he was due to respond to the first major $13 million lawsuit from Fine Art Partners was a glaringly obvious attempt to evade responsibility. So when Inigo went missing in early 2020, Fine Art Partners went directly to the FBI. They shared all the evidence they had, including detailed copies of art acquisition and sale contracts, as well as extensive email correspondence, laying out their increasing frustration about non-payment and, ultimately, fraud. As Daniel Temple later wrote to the court, when he disappeared, we also lost our hope to recover this money. All the while that Inigo was missing, investigators had been delving into the paper and electronic trail he left behind. They determined that for years he had engaged in what they called a scheme to defraud multiple individuals and entities in the art market, and had lied to obtain sales, funding, and loans. Andrew Adams supervised the Philbrick case in his role as chief of the money laundering unit for the Southern District of New York. While he wasn't able to comment specifically about the case, he did share his knowledge on DOJ policy and priorities and investigative techniques as it relates to art crime.
The DOJ and the FBI, as part of DOJ, have been doing art-related and cultural property cases for decades and decades. The FBI has had a dedicated team, the art crime team, since about 2004, so about 20 years, where agents are specially trained and specifically focused on art and cultural property offenses, forgeries, thefts, and frauds in that space. DOJ, meaning the prosecutors, is a little less formalized, but has had groups of prosecutors in Manhattan in particular, heavily focused in this area for about the same amount of time, if not longer. When the FBI gets a tip, when the FBI begins an investigation, their natural partners are the federal prosecutors, and it tends to go towards federal prosecution, the U.S. attorney's offices.
So, where does this process begin? As Deep Throat advises in All the President's Men, follow the money.
As with most frauds, they are fundamentally financial crimes. People are trying to steal money from other people. And the way that those thefts happen can be as varied as the human imagination. So in most cases, you are investigating crime in the art world by looking at the movement of money, how people lost money, how people were induced to send money. And from that perspective, it looks much like any kind of white-collar investigation of financial flows. Another way in which the two worlds intersect is the increasing financial sophistication of the art market itself. And the opportunities for investing in art grow along with the sort of growth in those opportunities, so grow the opportunities for fraud.
One of my sources told me about the days leading up to the arrest. He said Border Control agents had been prowling the area for about a week with a laptop in tow, showing photos and comparing white males for a match. He stated that Inigo either didn't realize how close the end was, or thought the virus and riots were helping bury his movements, a reference to both the COVID lockdown and weeks of protests after the murder of George Floyd that year. All the chaos that Inigo had left behind came to a head that June morning. When the plane left Vanuatu, the first stop was Guam, a deliberate geographical choice given that it's a U.S. territory. Inigo was then transferred to a federal detention center in Honolulu. Then, he was transferred to Chickasha, Oklahoma. Eventually, he was placed in the Metro Detention Center in Brooklyn, where repeated COVID-related delays impacted proceedings. One attorney I spoke to suggested to me that this rambling, disjointed trip back to New York was a form of what's known as diesel therapy, where authorities use repeated prison transfers as a way to try to wear a prisoner down in hopes of extracting information and securing some cooperation with the case. Jane Levine is an art industry veteran who was formerly the Chief Global Compliance Counsel for Sotheby's. Currently, she is a managing director of Art Risk Group, a recently formed advisory and investigative firm focused on risk issues related to art, antiquities, cultural property, and high-value collectibles.
The Philbrick case is actually, in some respects, very similar to many historic art fraud cases. In its basic structure, actually, consignment fraud or art investment fraud are actually not new. They are basically, at their core, Ponzi schemes that we've seen forever. They rely on exploiting trust, reputation, people who make it possible to convince others to part with their art or their money without protecting themselves. We've seen this before. Schemes tend to exploit people's inability to definitively track and record unique artworks. And that makes it possible to sell the same work to multiple parties. We've seen this movie before. The Philbrick scheme did manage to combine many of the various types of art fraud structures into one scheme. So we see in this sprawling matter multiple buyers of one work. We see fraud involving asset-backed lending. There's a little bit of fake documents thrown in. So it's in some ways a tutorial on the various types.
Ultimately, the civil lawsuits against Inigo helped provide something of a blueprint for important details of private transactions that would otherwise have remained secret. Fine Art Partners was just the start of it. That lawsuit detailed which artworks and how much money was missing based on their own art deals. Andrew points out that there are any number of ways in which art fraud can be flagged by authorities and warrant a closer look, even if they're buried in other legal filings.
So the way these cases can begin is as varied as the cases themselves. Tips from victims absolutely lead to major cases. Civil lawsuits too, and FBI and prosecutors paying attention to what's happening in the courts and on the civil side. Often those are civil cases that have nothing to do directly with fraud. It may be a divorce proceeding. It may be a bankruptcy proceeding, something that gives some insight into a contest over ownership or authenticity. Bank Secrecy Act and financial information from financial institutions can often lead to cases in this space. And that's particularly true with respect to economic sanctions, which has been another area of interest and increased resource across the department, but also in the art and cultural property space. Purchases by sanctioned individuals or through sanctioned financial institutions can be flagged by U.S. financial institutions. That's information that is fed in very often to the Treasury Department, to a group called FinCEN. FinCEN is a bureau within the Treasury Department. It's the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And what they are largely dedicated to doing is monitoring the U.S. financial system for money laundering concerns. As part of that, financial institutions in the U.S., including large banks, and in some cases, including places like precious metals dealers and others that have some connection to the cultural property market, are required to provide information to FinCEN about suspicious activity. And from there, the FBI, the Department of Justice, can begin building cases. And from there, DOJ can rapidly get involved. So it truly can come in the door in any number of ways. Red flags that get flagged by financial institutions can be everything from just aberrant activity in a particular account, someone being related to or associated in the media with a sanctioned individual, for example, the use of opaque shell company networks in order to do what would otherwise be relatively straightforward financial transactions. All of those things can contribute to red flags, to a suspicious activity report, and from there to an investigation. Banks, for example, may flag companies that are set up shortly before a transaction happens that seem unnecessary to the transaction, or that seem to just place layers of opacity between the ultimate beneficial owners and the transaction itself for no apparent reason from a tax perspective or from a financial perspective. There may be legitimate reasons for doing those things just from a privacy perspective, but when buyers or sellers or intermediaries don't have a easily cited reason for undertaking those kinds of non-transparent steps, it can lead to the sorts of reports that then lead to investigations.
The first hearing came roughly a month after his capture in mid-July 2020. It centered on his actions in the preceding months and his perceived intentions. He initially pleaded not guilty and was denied bail on the basis of being deemed a flight risk. He was also denied bail at numerous subsequent hearings. After weeks of being shuffled between jails and an extended stay in Brooklyn's notorious Metro Detention Center, in November 2021, Inigo changed his plea to guilty. He was charged with 1 count of wire fraud, which carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in jail. He was ordered to pay back more than $86 million that was traceable to the fraud. It's hard to believe that so many millions of stolen dollars, fraudulent deals, and numerous victims could come down to a single charge of wire fraud. Reflecting back on many of the art crime cases I've reported on, the criminal prosecution often involves charges of wire fraud. In the most recent case of disgraced art advisor Lisa Schiff, as well as Glafira Rosales, a central figure in the Knoedler forgery scandal, and in 2018, former Park Avenue art dealer Ezra Cheweki spent 18 months in jail. All had pleaded guilty to charges of wire fraud. Why not theft or conspiracy? Well, it seems that wire fraud covers a wide range of activities and serves as a nice blanket charge for a variety of crimes, providing leverage for prosecutors.
Wire fraud and mail fraud are two different statutes that read almost identically. They are about 150 years old. They're both statutes that were passed shortly after the Civil War as part of a expansion of federal power in the wake of the Civil War. And they are intended to be broad. They're drafted broadly. They have not changed very much in their language in about 150 years. The wire part, or the mail part, is purely a way of making a crime federal. You're looking for interstate wires. You're looking for the use of the U.S. mails. If you don't have that sort of hook from a federal perspective, then the crime should be a state crime. You need to have some sort of federal nexus or federal jurisdictional hook. But beyond that sort of specific aspect, they are extremely broad, and intentionally so. They're designed to be flexible. They're designed to capture, again, the broad expanse of human imagination that can be used for bad purposes. There's a judge who is now on the Southern District of New York. Previously, he had been in private practice and a prosecutor before that, Judge Rakoff. He described I think he was speaking of the mail fraud statute, but it's the same as the wire fraud statute, as a favorite of prosecutors, precisely because it is adaptable, flexible, and simple in essence, and can be used to combat everything from public corruption to fraud on the art market. But the way that it's drafted is that it penalizes and prohibits schemes. And the particular facts or the particular actions that make up some overarching scheme to separate a victim from his or her money may be quite varied. And it may take many, many steps, and it may involve multiple iterations of sales. It may involve multiple kinds of lies. But if it is all in furtherance of an overarching scheme, then it can be charged as one single count. It comes down to what most people, I think, intuitively think of as fraud. If you are lying in order to obtain money from someone, you are committing a fraud. To commit a wire fraud, you need to do that through the use of interstate wires, email, telephone, text message, whatever. If you want to commit mail fraud, or if you are committing mail fraud, you'll do that through the use of the U.S. postal system or FedEx or something like that. But the gravamen here is a lie. It can be an affirmative misrepresentation. I can tell you something that's literally untrue. Or it can be a false pretense. I can lead you to believe something is true when it is not true for the purpose of taking property from you. It can be money, it can be artwork, whatever it might be. But the core is, I think, what most people sort of feel in their gut as fraud. That's what wire fraud and mail fraud target. A wire fraud investigation may ultimately become a money laundering investigation. It may ultimately become a narcotics investigation. Depends on what the facts lead you to. But for an investigator, it is a good tool for opening a case. Wire fraud, mail fraud are quite broad. If you're dealing with something that feels like a lie for money, you can use it to open the case and then charge forward from there. Once you've charged the case, if the question or the interest is, if I see an indictment come down with wire fraud, do I necessarily expect that that's just the beginning of a series of new charges? The answer is not necessarily. because it is so broad, it may actually encompass everything that the prosecutor wants to do without needing to go and bring additional charges down the line. One nuance on that I would note, and it's important in the art context and relates to financial penalties. Wire fraud and mail fraud carry forfeiture, which means that proceeds from the crime can be recouped, can be taken away from the defendant and given to the United States. Often it's used to repay victims as part of a restitution. But it is only used to take back proceeds of the fraud. So if I lie to somebody and get $100,000 and put it into my bank account and then move that money around to hide it, then if it's just a wire fraud charge, I owe $100,000 in forfeiture. Money laundering is a more powerful tool from a forfeiture perspective because it takes not just the proceeds, but all the money that's involved in an offense. And so what you will often see are cases that begin with wire fraud or mail fraud and include at some point a money laundering charge. Is what you get out of that as a prosecutor is the ability to say that $100,000 of fraud money was put into a bank account with another $100,000. Maybe it's clean, maybe it's dirty, we don't know, but it was used to mask the fact of fraud. It was used to commingle money and then move it through the financial system undetected by banks looking for suspicious activity. With a money laundering charge, you can go after not just the stolen money, but the clean money also, and say you've got $200,000 that you owe. So prosecutors, particularly in New York, where they are quite attuned to this, will often include or be aiming for a money laundering charge on top of or in addition to wire fraud.
It was another 6 months until Inigo learned his fate in a downtown New York federal courtroom. He was sentenced to 7 years in jail, and the 2 years he had already served would count towards that total. In the end, he was out by spring of 2024. Don't ask me to do the math about how 7 years became less than 4, but I recall reading something related to good behavior and prison overcrowding. Despite all of Inigo's assertions about the questionable involvement of other art world players, the only other person identified and prosecuted for the fraud was his former colleague, Robert Newland. He received an 18-month prison sentence after pleading guilty and sharing a lot of the details about what went down in their fraudulent art business, far more than Inigo ever did. Newland was released after 9 months. Once Inigo was released from federal prison in Pennsylvania, he wasted no time trying to clean up his public image. He traded in his prison garb for J. Crew-esque fits in a sprawling Vanity Fair profile and photo spread with his now wife Victoria and daughter Gaia, who was born several months after Inigo's arrest. Based on social media, he's living a relatively normal post-prison life with Victoria in Rhode Island, where he was ordered to a halfway house immediately after prison as part of the terms of release. In one of his posts, he makes light of his ankle monitoring bracelet, calling it his ball and chain, along with the hashtag Prisons Without Walls. Meanwhile, Victoria gave birth to another baby girl this past May. A key part of Inigo's defense strategy was to blame the system, as opposed to his individual actions. After his guilty plea, his attorney, Jeffrey Lichtman, stated, while his actions were dishonest and criminal in nature, he's part of an industry sick from top to bottom, where this sort of behavior is sadly commonplace.
There are a few areas where I think there's increasing interest and scrutiny. One is in money laundering and the notion that art as an investment vehicle or more portable kind of asset, as opposed to a cultural property trophy that a person will keep for their entire life, presents risks of money laundering, to be sure. And it's a market that has, for many, many years, in some cases, prided itself on a lack of transparency and certainly places a high value on privacy and personal connection in a way that I think investigators and prosecutors view as a context in which laundering and fraud is ripe. As the market becomes, I think, more democratized, as art in itself becomes something more like a financial asset, then the opportunities for that kind of laundering activity only increase. And I think people will be increasingly interested in anti-money laundering efforts in the art space as a result. Not just prosecutors and investigators, but you see this in institutions on the private side too. Large auction houses have devoted fairly substantial resources towards anti-money laundering at this point. I see an uptick in similar kinds of efforts even within places like museums and galleries that are not traditionally the guardians of the financial integrity of the U.S. financial system. But there's a real interest in staying on the right side of the line. And I think that's incentivized in part by the shift in the market at sort of the macro level.
Art dealer and Nota Bene podcaster Ben Godsill finds that on balance, the art market is self-policed, but that nonetheless it is subject to vulnerabilities that unscrupulous people will try to exploit.
Generally in life, if you're being greedy and think you have an edge, the universe has a way of slapping you down and teaching you a lesson. Not always, but eventually, and you have to acknowledge that that possibility is always out there. I think in terms of boots on the ground facts, I think we'll see increased legalization, but as the contracts that Inigo and FAP signed show, where there's a will for fraud and negligence and bad actors, there's always going to be a way. That said, within the art space, within the art market, within the world of art, because it is still relatively so small and there are so many personal relationships and handshakes, I'd say there's actually a higher level of trust and surety in this than just about any other industry where you're dealing with totally anonymous counterparties.
In the past, there have been efforts to implement better oversight of the art market. But, as art law specialist Judd Grossman observes, efforts to govern the art trade have been inconsistent at best.
I mean, there's always talk about enhancing regulations and oversight. You've seen some of it abroad with anti-money laundering type laws, trying to lower the curtain a bit with less lack of transparency, more clarity. Oddly, New York City, I think on its own initiative, if anybody knows who lobbied behind the legislation, please let me know, but relaxed some of its rules.
In a system that lacks regulation and is often conducted on the informal concept of "I trust you," as opposed to a formal written contract, are there steps that players can take to protect themselves? As we have seen, in most or many of the convoluted deals Inigo was pitching and structuring, not having control of the artwork or taking someone else's word about its whereabouts proved particularly problematic.
I think, again, when you don't have your work physically with you, there are steps you can take to protect yourself against situations like this. Filing what's called a Uniform Commercial Code, UCC 1 form, puts the world on notice that the property in someone else's possession is yours. And no matter what that gallery or dealer or consignee, whatever the case may be, whatever they may owe a third party, that third party can't look to the consignor's property, the true owner's property, to satisfy that debt. And by filing that little one-page document, it goes a long way to preventing that outcome.
Jane Levine says even in a business that tends to be very opaque, she advises people to be proactive and discerning. People can often protect themselves by not being afraid to ask a lot of questions, and further, treating the information gleaned critically.
Another feature of many art fraud cases is that the victims are super sophisticated in business, right? Many of them are really experienced art collectors and buyers. They have a ton of money and resources frequently. It's just not unusual for that to be the case in these types of frauds, right? We're dealing with extremely wealthy, high-end, successful, smart people. Is it a question, are they approaching art deals more casually or informally than they would in other business transactions? So it's not like you can go check a database to verify. You do have to rely on representations, but you can, just the process of making sure that you want to get a representation and ask as many questions and get written authorization that can flesh out whether there are any red flags and avoid problems. This is a feature not only of the art market, but really the business world. One simple step that happens in the banking world as the first step is to make it part of the process, to demand and require the customer to identify the ultimate beneficial owners of the entity. Just even asking the question and getting a sworn representation is an important first step. Now, there's no way to verify that information because by the very definition in most jurisdictions, there's no legal requirement to record the actual beneficial owners. It may require some simple independent investigation, asking around, simple steps to verify whether or not this adds up. Does it make sense? Or internet research can sometimes turn up links between named entities and individuals who are the beneficial owners. If you're transacting with an entity, what bank is that entity banking at? And who are the people who are structuring the transactions? There are questions that can be asked, factors that can be looked at. Without a lot of extra time or money or effort, you can try to penetrate behind who are the human beings that are actually the owners of this company. But you need to start with asking the question.
Probably one of the most shocking aspects of the Vanity Fair profile is when Inigo stated, "I'd like to get reestablished as an art dealer." The art world has a long memory, especially when tens of millions of dollars are at stake. You'll see the same players at the fairs, biennials, and auctions. Is it possible for someone who has done so much damage to return? To Ben, it's pretty cut and dry.
I can't foresee a future where Inigo is able to act at the highest levels of the art market as an art dealer or an intermediary. I just don't think anyone would be willing to have him as a counterparty.
Prominent art advisor Todd Levin stresses that in art dealing, reputation and integrity is everything. For those who are driven purely by money, he believes there are way more viable alternatives than the art world.
If somebody comes into the art world and essentially damages artists' markets and artists' careers, what kind of person then wants to give them a second chance and begin to deal with them and trust them? That's why him coming back into the market seems so bizarre to me. What I was really interested was, as he said, the commerce of the gallery world, which means the commerce was the primary thing. There are much easier ways and much more efficacious ways to make a lot of money quickly than the art world. Go into trading, go into stocks, go into crypto, go into whatever, and then you don't have to worry about all the side stuff of the art. You're just dealing with the commerce. So I think he would actually be better off just figuring what his best fit is and going into the world of commerce and just focusing on one thing and one thing only, which is making as much money as quickly as possible to pay back his $86 million debt that he owes to everybody. That's really what he should be focused on now, not trying to get back into the art world. And as he sort of was mentioning in the Vanity Fair article, that he was going to now to try to act with integrity. You don't say that you're going to try to be honest or loyal or trustworthy. You just are, or you're not. It's like being pregnant.
Accomplished art journalist Charlotte Burns, who has watched her fair share of market ups and downs and bad actors in the art world, has a different spin.
I think a lot of these people are like Teflon, like nothing sticks. I truly think that if you make people money in the art world, there is a whole lot of people who will deal with you. I'm not sure the art world overly worries itself a lot of the time with moral and ethical failings. I think that's something that journalists write about. I think that's something that a certain part of the art world worries about. But I think that we are not an industry overly stressed about that. We're a fairly relaxed industry in a lot of ways. We're a fairly progressive industry in some ways. That's one aspect of that. And I think in another aspect, we're fairly opaque. And so I'm not sure that as an industry, the market has ever been particularly concerned about ethics and morals. That's part of some of those scandals. And I think in a way, they're human stories of excess. And I think that they make kind of sense in the context of excess. And they tell a story, I think, of a period of boom and greed and gluttony in this period of which we've lived, when there's been so much painting and so much money and so much art production, and not all of it good. And there've been dark sides to that. And we're kind of coming to the end of that period and having to kind of do a reckoning of what it meant and sift through everything. What art was worth keeping? Were all those museums good? Did we need all those wings? Was it better to just fix the leaky toilet? Did we do it all the right way? Did the money shake out properly? And so we're kind of at that period of reckoning, I think. And some of it was great, and some of it was super fun, and some of it went too far. But it's definitely over. And for some people, like really over. Some people like really, really over.
Can old art fraud scandals tell us anything about how the Inigo Philbrick saga will play out? Or do they just remind us that, in the art world, the same dramas repeat themselves over and over again? Take the Knoedler Gallery. For 165 years, it was an institution in New York, and then in 2011, gone. Shuttered overnight under the shadow of an $80 million forgery scheme, years before a case ever got to trial. Then there's Larry Salander, whose victims included John McEnroe and Robert De Niro. He served a 6-year sentence for fraud, estimated at $120 million, and has not resurfaced in the art world since he was released from prison in 2016. As for the notorious art fraudster Michel Cohen, whose schemes were estimated at upwards of $50 million, he fled the United States in 2001, was caught and imprisoned in Brazil, only to organize a daring escape. Eventually, he landed in France, where he remains in hiding today. In many of the cases, long after the jail time has been served, victims of the fraud are still left fighting for the return of their money or the actual property, often with no real paperwork to demonstrate how the convoluted handshake deals happened. And the art world, the same world that made these schemes possible, keeps going, unshaken, unchanged. While some of the Inigo cases have been settled, such as the Stengel, a Basquiat, and a Kusama, many of these are ultimately resolved on secret conditions that provide no real insight into how such complicated financial fights are settled. He betrayed everyone he had ever worked with. Inigo Philbrick is a stone-cold criminal who was driven by greed and the wish to finance his lavish lifestyle, stated fine art partners in court documents. Their losses are now estimated at upwards of $20 million, which includes roughly $1 million in legal fees alone. They are still embroiled in tense litigation. It's clear that the combination of lack of oversight and the increasingly sophisticated financialization of the art trade have caused major losses and headaches for some players. Art fraud isn't just about theft of money or works. It's about the stories we tell ourselves, about authenticity, value, and trust. Behind every scandal and victim is a reminder that the art world is as vulnerable as it is dazzling. World Infamy is produced by Sonia Manalili. We hope you enjoyed the series. If you'd like to hear more stories and analysis from across the art world, subscribe to The Art Angle on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.